all for coming out and sharing this time with me on a Sunday. It's my honor. It's my pleasure to be here. I know some of you I've spoken with as early as 2008, and we tried to figure out how to make this relationship work, and I think we're finding a way. So I'm going to talk to you today about some work that I've been doing for the last 15 years. It's on frogs, and you might be thinking, who cares about frogs? We're trying to get rid of the frogs we have here in Hawaii anyway. But hopefully I'm going to convince you that you should care about the frogs, but we're also going to talk about humans as well. Before I start, it's sort of my tradition that I always do the thank yous and acknowledgments first, so that if you decide you want to kick me out, I make sure the important stuff's done. I've already thanked and acknowledged you. I want to thank Kyle for bringing me out and everybody for showing me a great time. But before I start to talk about the work, I want to thank my family, my wife and my son and my daughter for their love and support. I want to acknowledge my funding sources, and I want to disclose that I have been funded by the manufacturer of atrazine. Trust me, though, we're not still hanging out together. I'll sort of give you what I call words from my former sponsor as we go along today. I want to thank all of the students that have been involved. I've worked with a lot of undergraduates. Those people are shown in blue. Wonderful, diverse group of people. Here's a fairly recent picture of some of my students. Many of them, such as Jesus here, and Suzuki, and Wynn, live in agricultural communities, so they were not only just students at Berkeley, they were students whose families and themselves have been impacted and sprayed and working with these pesticides. And just for Kia, there's my Allegheny student right there, Paul. And also this is Sherry Gallipo. She's from Ilo, and she will be the first native Pacific Island to get a doctoral degree in the history of the University of California, Berkeley. She was my student. And hopefully, if things go well, both of us might be moving back here. She'll be moving back, I might be moving here to work at the University of Hawaii. We'll see how that works. And this is just a list of my current students. And then finally, I want to acknowledge my family in general, my parents, for their love and encouragement and support for the last 45 years of my life. And I want to dedicate this to my grandmother. She passed away in 2005, but before she passed away, she passed on her love of teaching and her desire to make the world a better place through teaching to me. And I'm forever thankful for that. She also taught me how to kind of tell a good story. So I hope I'm going to tell a good story today. So let's just get right down to it. Atrazine, this is it. If you're chemically inclined, if you just have to know what it looks like. It's mostly used on corn. In particular, it's used on GMO corn and experimental corn. It's been used extensively also historically here in Hawaii on sugarcane in both Hawaii and Florida. Sugarcane has been a big use of atrazine as well. It's an herbicide or a weed killer. When I say the word pesticide, sometimes I slip into that. I'll mean anything that kills a pest. So an herbicide or a weed killer is just one type of pesticide in the way that I use the word. It's been used since 1958, so it's been around for quite some time. We use 80 million pounds annually in the United States. Until recently, until Roundup, it was the #1 selling herbicide, the #1 selling weed killer. Interestingly, it's also used in more than 80 countries, but is now outlawed in all of Europe. And now, no offense to lawyers, but they're lawyers. Syngenta's lawyers keep writing to me saying it has not been outlawed. It has been denied regulatory approval. Somehow that's supposed to be different. But what I know is that this one pisses them off, so I keep saying this. So we're going to talk about the African clawed frog. I usually make this joke. They actually have these here in Hawaii. They're originally from Africa. We also collect them in California. So I always make this joke. So technically they're African-American clawed frogs, but the real name is the African clawed frog. Let me tell you a story about the African clawed frog before we start. Who's ever heard of it? Xenopus, it's called. It's like the #1 used frog in biology studies around the world for a really interesting reason. Here's the reason. Turns out in 1920, somebody discovered that the pregnancy hormone, HCG, that's required for you to maintain a pregnancy, so everybody here depended on HCG, that hormone will make this frog lay eggs. This is a true story. You can Google it. So it turns out by 1940, this frog was the pregnancy test. If you thought you were pregnant, you'd go to the hospital, and they would inject this frog with your urine, and if you were pregnant, the frog would lay eggs, and then you'd be either happy or sad, depending on your situation. So here's why I tell you this story, a couple of reasons. One is somebody, it was Lauren who just said, science can be kind of silly sometimes, right? who's the first guy who thought, you know, I wonder what will happen if I inject pee into a frog? like how did that get discovered? That's sort of amazing. The second reason I tell the story is, here's the first reason you should care about frogs. When I tell you what atrazine does to frogs, you should remember that our hormones are so similar to frog hormones that our pregnancy hormone will make this frog lay eggs. So if I tell you what atrazine does to reproductive capabilities in this frog, you should be thinking, what about me? In addition to caring about the frogs in general. And that's where we're going to go. I'm going to tell you, what about you? So here's what we discovered. And I was originally doing research for a company at the time. They were paying the bills. And I discovered that if you raise these frogs in atrazine, their larynx, or their voice box, didn't grow. Here's why that's bad news. Again, the similarities are important. The reason that men have deeper voices than women is because testosterone makes our voice box grow, the male hormone. Frogs, the males sing and the females don't for the same reason. So the idea is that these frogs, their gonads, their reproductive parts, weren't making the hormone properly. So while still working, being paid by the company, we decided to dissect some of these frogs, and we have to do that. And these are the kidneys. Their gonads are inside. There was a testes, so it's a male. But then this one had ovaries, then it had another testis, then it had more ovaries. Like, there's a whole party going on. You didn't have to leave home, right? And we knew that's just, and that's not a judgment call. Just normally frogs, males are males and females are females. As you may know, there are fish that are naturally hermaphrodites. There are no frogs that should naturally look like this. So we knew there was a problem. So we proposed the following. If this big circle is a testis, or a testicle if you're a human, same thing, you should make testosterone. That's the male hormone. You know where that word comes from? Everybody's heard of testosterone, right? Who's the bicycler just got busted for taking extra testosterone? It's the male hormone. The word literally means testicular hormone, testosterone. That's the way the word comes from. Two words pushed together. So we proposed, you just heard about enzymes, we proposed that atrazine turned on an enzyme. And in this case, this enzyme aromatase is the enzyme, the machinery that converts testosterone into estrogen. Estrogen stands for estrus-generating hormone. So it's the female hormone. So if you're a male exposed to atrazine, your testosterone goes away, so you're demasculinized, you're chemically castrated. And you're also feminized because now you're making estrogen, which you should not be doing as a male. Females, yeah, it's a good thing. For men, it generates a problem. So we could measure that. So just like you can go to the doctor and have your hormones measured, we can measure that in frogs. So here's what control or normal males look like. That's their testosterone level. Here's what atrazine-treated males look like. And here's what females look like. So they are chemically castrated. I use that word a lot because the company doesn't like it. That's just the kind of guy I am. So we could prove that they were chemically castrated. Now here's the result of that. Okay, what you're looking at now are testes sliced real thin under the microscope. So just imagine I've sliced a salami. You're looking at one slice blown up. What you're looking at in the control, if I blow this section up, these are testicular tubules, just like we have, guys, filled with sperm. That's all sperm. And sperm need testosterone to grow. If you're exposed to atrazine, I'll blow this up. That's the testicular tubule, but that's just junk. Like you see all those dark things there? That's all the sperm heads lined up. And in this case, that's all just cellular debris or junk or garbage. All the rats got in. Break it down that way. Ate all the chicks. In this case, the chicks are sperm. That just sounded kind of gross, but you get the point. You get the point. Here's the other thing we discovered, and we've published all this now. This has all been peer-reviewed. We discovered that when these frogs grow up to 10% of the males can completely turn into females. So, for example, we have a genetic marker, so we can tell only females have this little piece of DNA that's shown here. So that's a male. See the guy who kind of looks like he's smiling? And you can guess what he's doing. If you're not okay with it, I usually tell my 5th graders, this frog hurt its leg and that one's giving it a ride home. That's his brother. So about 10% of these males completely turn into females. So for example, this one lays eggs just like a female, even though it's a male. He, in fact, is a grandmother. He was completely converted because he made so much estrogen that he turned into a female. In other cases, we get animals that look like this. So this is gonads from a North American leopard frog, and these are the testes, okay? So those are male parts. And these I usually call it junk in the trunk. You know what all that is? These are eggs, that's right, that are bursting through the surface of this male's testes. Now, you just heard Lauren mention the EPA. I was involved with the EPA. And in fact, this was published in Nature. It's a big deal to publish in Nature. I sent this photo and these data to the EPA because they were reviewing atrazine. And they emailed me back, and it went something like, "Dear Dr. Hayes, thank you very much for the interesting data. However, we do not feel that this is an adverse effect that would trigger re-review for deregulation of atrazine." Now, here's a story I always tell. My wife tells me that there is nothing more painful in life than childbirth. And based on the grip she had on my hand when my son was delivered, I gotta agree. But guys, are you with me on this? A dozen chicken eggs in my testicle. Doesn't that seem like it should be somewhere in the top 5 or something? Right? But the EPA says it's not an adverse effect. The EPA says it's not anything to worry about, even though they had the data even before it was published. So we did some work, and we showed that this is not just a laboratory artifact, that frogs develop this way in the wild. And I'm not going to show you all of those data. It's all been published. But what I want to do is we talked about levels. I want to give you an idea of what levels we're talking about. First off, the effects of atrazine are produced at 0.1 parts per billion. That's 0.1 micrograms per liter. And if you're like me, that means absolutely nothing, right? You can't, how much is that? I don't know. Here's how much that is. It's 1/1000th of a grain of salt in a gallon. 1/1000th of a grain of salt in a gallon. That's what produces those effects. But believe it or not, hormones are active at 100 times lower than that. So while a toxicologist might tell you that's a low dose, to somebody who studies hormones, to an endocrinologist, it's a high dose. Here's the problem. The package of atrazine recommends that farmers apply it at 2.9 to 29 million parts per billion. So a typical farmer might be applying this stuff at levels that are 290 million times higher than we use in the laboratory. You can Google these numbers and pick them out. Here's the minimum and maximum detected in agricultural runoff, temporary pools, permanent water like lakes and rivers, and rainwater. Here's the level that we're using in the laboratory. So here's what would be at risk. There's enough atrazine in rainwater to produce these effects. In fact, it can go up on dust. Sound familiar? It can go up on dust. It can travel over 1,000 miles and come down into rainwater. The U.S. Geological Survey can measure atrazine in the rainwater in Minnesota from when farmers apply it in Kansas. That's why the European Union banned it. Because France banned it, and then it was coming over in the rain from Germany, so the European Union said, okay, everybody has to stop using it. And if it can travel over 1,000 miles, it can certainly travel during application. It can certainly travel in a dusty place. It can certainly travel in the rainwater even further than that. What's more is, here's the 3 parts per billion. That's what the EPA says is safe for drinking water. And you just heard Lauren talk about this 1,000-fold safety factor. That's because atrazine causes tumors in rats of the brain, I believe it is, at 3,000 parts per billion. So they divide it by 10, because they only use one strain of rat. That's a safety factor. They divide by 10, because a rat's only one species, and then they divide by another 10 just to be safe. But they never tested 3 parts per billion. They never looked for the kinds of effects that we looked for. They found one effect at a high dose and divided by 1,000 and said, okay, that's okay in your drinking water. That's where those numbers come from. And in fact, in many of these cases, Roundup is an example, in many cases, the safety limit is set at what they can detect. Lead's the same way. They regulate the chemicals. They go, well, we can't measure it below that, so that's the safety limit. And we know that that's not true. Even the hormone estrogen is active at levels that we can't detect. Our body is much better at detecting it. So you heard a lot about mixtures. This is a photograph from Nebraska. We got concerned with what happens with atrazine when you mix it with other chemicals. Okay? It's almost like Lauren and I planned our talks together and tag team on this. Here's what happened. We did an experiment on Salinas. And Salinas River runs south to north, and all the farms are in the north. And we wanted to know, and we don't know. We know that they're using hundreds and hundreds of chemicals. We don't know which ones on which farms, but we know that they all run off into the river. Again, that might sound familiar. So, for example, we did an experiment where we start upstream, upriver, and this is where rich people in California get their water from. It's in a place called Santa Margarita, and there's no pesticides and no other stressors. Then we went downriver. This is a place called Atascadero, and you just heard about physical stressors. So here they're physical stressors. So there's about 3,000 tadpoles in a pond there that has 1 inch of water, and it's about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're physically stressed, not chemically stressed. Further downstream, the water's here again, because this water's all been drained off for agriculture. And further downstream, all that water is agricultural runoff. So there are no more physical stressors. The water's 2 feet deep, 20 degrees Celsius, but they're pesticide stressors. This is probably not true of Hawaii, but when I give a talk anywhere else in the US, I remind people that they've eaten from Salinas. 85% of the US's lettuce comes from this one little valley. That's only about 2 hours drive. 85% of the country's lettuce. Here's what that looks like. If you go collect tadpoles down that river, this is one from Santa Margarita from the clean site. This is one from that inch of 100 degree water. And this tadpole, which also has an inability to fight off diseases, is loaded with parasites. This tadpole has no physical stressors. The only difference between this one and this one, they're the same age, same developmental stage, collected on the same day. This one lives downstream of water that's running off of our food. That's the only difference. Same temperature, same water height, same river, same age, same day, same species. But these tiny tadpoles are suffering from water. Here's where we collect them. That's surrounded by agriculture. Living downstream is kind of tough. So now the question is, why should you care about what's going on in California? Why should you care about frogs when there are no native? In fact, I got a call once, somebody who wanted to know if I could use atrazine to help get rid of the cocaine. I said, no, you don't want to do that. Here are the reasons why, if you don't care about frogs. This is actually from Lake Nabugabu in Uganda, another place I used to work. And this is a crop, I believe it's arrowroot. And the water that's running off from that crop is what the village uses for their drinking water, their cooking water, their bathing water. Here's why I showed this slide. If I told the villagers that the frogs and the fish in that water have reproductive problems, they can't make sperm, they have eggs in their testes, they have high disease because their immune system's been affected, the connection between environmental health and public health is clear because you're getting your water right out of, the water's running off your food, affecting those animals, and you're collecting it and taking it back home. The problem is, and maybe it's not the problem here, the problem with us is, I always joke, here's my village, this is Oakland, and my water comes from there, but it just comes out of a faucet. And we make these assumptions, like you just heard about, that there's safety levels and things that are protecting us. Well, maybe the people in this room don't make those assumptions, but the majority of Americans, I think, make those assumptions that they're protected, and that the water's the last thing that they have to worry about. And it's probably true, we don't have to worry about coliform bacteria like you do in some other countries, but there's plenty to worry about. So this is a slide now. We're going to switch up a little bit. A colleague of mine that wrote in ecoepidemiology, so the study of disease in wildlife, the occurrence of an association in more than one species and species population is very strong evidence for causation. So what this person's saying is that if you find a chemical, for example, in the wild, and you find sick animals associated with that chemical, and you find that in more than one population, then that's support that that chemical is causing the problem. Okay? Correlation. What I just told you about, though, is experimental evidence, not just correlation. We actually have experimental evidence in more than one population, more than one species, more than one genera, and multiple families of frogs. Here's why you should care about frogs. The same things are true of fish. Right? If you're living here with contaminated, agricultural chemical, contaminated water running off into the Pacific Ocean and running off then there are going to be problems with fish, I guarantee you. Probably bigger problems than frogs. But other researchers have shown that there are problems with reptiles and birds, and then finally I'm going to tell you about mammals, of which we are. I'm going to tell you about not only correlations with poor health outcomes in humans, but I'm going to tell you about experimental data on rats and on human cells that have been done in the laboratory. First, let me tell you a little bit about Syngenta, the manufacturer. A couple things have happened. One is, here's a couple of news articles that have come out. Syngenta hired guns, attacked new documentary. This is a film that I was in to try to spread and make this information available. Here's another one, revealed how Syngenta investigated the press and shaped the news about the controversial weed killer atrazine. I've been the victim of personal verbal attacks. They've never physically attacked me, they've threatened to. And they just settled the lawsuit, and documents were made public that they tapped my phone, that they hacked my emails. They hired somebody to work up my psychological profile so that they could figure out how to harass me. And they actually wrote it down. Like, wait, you wrote that down? Have his email. So I'm not just paranoid. This is real, although, you know, there's that saying, the key to a successful life of paranoia is to keep careful track of your persecutors. Not kidding. Here's what I decided to do, though. Because they were attacking me, saying, oh, it's Hayes, he has an agenda, he's an activist, and he's crazy. I'm not denying the last part. What I decided to do was I emailed everybody in the world, this is only a partial list, and I said, hey, let's all write a paper on atrazine so that the community, so that people know it's not just one scientist battling, it's not just one animal, one species. We want to know how broad are the problems with atrazine. And we represent now 20 countries, academic university scientists who've studied atrazine. We published one paper, you can see some of us here, there's about 12 countries represented. And here's some of the things that we discovered, and here's why you should worry about atrazine, even if you don't care about frogs. Remember I showed you frogs with sperm in the testis, you give them atrazine and the sperm goes away. There's a guy in Belgium that showed the same thing in fish. Give a fish atrazine and you can see there's no sperm in the testis. This is reptiles down in Argentina. This is like a big alligator called a caiman. See the testicular tubule, there's no sperm when it's exposed to atrazine. This is rats, mammals, like us. Here's a testicular tubule with sperm. Give it atrazine, no sperm. That work was done in Croatia and in Nigeria. And this is work from Pakistan showing that if you take quail, there's sperm in the testis, you give them atrazine, you can see that it's empty, right? Picture's worth 1,000 words. The other thing I told you is that the reason that the sperm is gone is because atrazine knocks out testosterone in frogs. So do you see that in other animals? Well, here's salmon. This is fish. This is what happens when you give a fish atrazine. There's no testosterone and there's no sperm. This work was published in England. Here's frogs and here's rats. You give a rat atrazine and his sperm count goes down. And rats, of course, are mammals like us. Now we're going to talk about humans. This is Shauna Swan's work from 2003. And here's what she showed. Here's atrazine levels on what she called control men. These are humans now. So she went around and she collected urine. I guess she had the men give them a sample of urine, give her a sample of urine. And then she measured atrazine in it. And men who can't get their wives pregnant and have low sperm count have significantly more atrazine in their urine. Now, that's a correlation. But we know that the sperm goes away when you give a fish atrazine, when you give a frog atrazine, when you give a reptile atrazine, when you give a bird atrazine, when you give a rat atrazine. Testosterone goes down and the sperm goes away. And now this correlation says there's an association with humans as well. Does that make sense? Now I'm going to show you a trick. Here's a PowerPoint trick. The data's still there. I squashed it down. Because here are the atrazine levels studied by a colleague in California in field workers, men who work on the farm. Now I'm going to squash it down again. Here's the atrazine levels in men who apply atrazine to the fields. 2,400 parts per billion. So a man who applies atrazine in the field had atrazine levels in his urine that are 24,000 times what we know is associated with low sperm count. And men in Missouri, where this study was done. Men who apply atrazine have 24,000 times the atrazine in their urine that we use in our laboratory to chemically castrate frogs and fish. Think about that. One of these guys could pee in a bucket. I could dilute their urine 24,000 times, and I could use the atrazine in their urine to chemically castrate and make hermaphrodites out of 24,000 buckets of 30 tadpoles each. But nothing is known about the health of these men. In California, which is the fifth, I don't know if you guys knew this, we produce 50% of the U.S.'s food. If California were its own country, we'd be the fifth richest country in the world because of agriculture. And I pulled this map out because you didn't care, but I probably don't care. But if you look at the top 10 counties for agriculture, they directly overlap with the 30 poorest towns in California. So you basically have minorities who are making us the fifth largest economy in the world, mostly Mexican Americans, who are exposed not just to atrazine, right? They're exposed to chlorpacrin, which was originally developed as a nerve gas. In many cases, life expectancies are 50 in the workers, and also when those workers, and when their wives are pregnant, or when the wives are actually picking, they're also exposed. So you're exposed in utero, in the womb, before you're even born. And we'll get to that in a minute. Oh, these are words from my former sponsor. So if you're making money off this stuff, you have a different perspective. If you're the one getting sprayed with it, I think it's a different story. So does atrazine turn on aromatase, that enzyme that turns testosterone into estrogen? Phytogenesis just means making egg yolk, and oogenesis just means making eggs. I told you that that happens in frogs, so there's eggs in the testis. Here's eggs in the testis of fish, published by another laboratory, and here's eggs in the testis of a turtle. So it's not just frogs, it's fish, it's reptiles, it's amphibians, frogs, that show this response to, this feminizing response to atrazine. In humans, you would worry about breast cancer and prostate cancer, because these are both dependent on aromatase and estrogen, as I'll show you. With regards to prostate cancer, here's data from their own factory. This is published. These are their own data. There's an 8.4-fold increase in prostate cancer in the men who work in their factory bagging atrazine. That's compared to men who work in the factory but don't work in the room where the atrazine is. 8.4 times. And the community is 80% black, African American. I'll tell you why that's important. With breast cancer, there's a study showing with incredible significance that women whose well water is contaminated with atrazine are more likely to get breast cancer compared to women in the same community that don't use that well water. And that's just correlation, right? Except that if you look at rats, I already told you, atrazine causes testosterone to go down, but atrazine also causes estrogen to go up, just like we showed in frogs. And then if you look at the breast cancer incidence, if you give rats atrazine, there's significantly more breast cancer in the rats. So that's experimental evidence. If you take a rat and give it atrazine, it makes estrogen and it gets breast cancer. And just by coincidence, women who drink atrazine-contaminated water are more likely to get breast cancer. This is goes a little bit further, though. If you take human cell lines, and we published this as well as other laboratories, here's a control cell line. So it's just set to background. If you give a human cell atrazine, it starts expressing aromatase and making estrogen. Just like we've shown in fish, just like we've shown in frogs, just like we've shown in reptiles, just like we've shown in birds, just like we've shown in rats, humans are no different. You give us atrazine, we start making estrogen. Now, I tried to go for 10 minutes. They wouldn't let me in. They have a pipe that runs right into the Mississippi River. 1.2 million pounds of atrazine flow into the Gulf of Mexico every year. And much of the community looks like this. They're allowed to do it. Much of the community looks like this. Here's why I bring up the minority issues. And these are data for African Americans, for American blacks. But I can show you similar data for Hispanics that's available. These are the top 13 cancers that people get in the US. And red now, 11 of the 13 are ones that you're more likely to get if you're black. And again, I can show you the same data for Hispanics. These are now, that line is the mortality rate, the death rate from these cancers in Caucasian or white Americans. And here now the death rates in African Americans and blacks. For 13 out of 13 cancers, you're more likely to die if you're black or Hispanic. And that's corrected for access to the doctor, that's corrected for economic status. And here are the things that we're trying to study in my laboratory now. Does that mean that there's a biological or a genetic difference? It's possible. But they don't even have cell lines to test that now. So, for example, when the doctor tells you you're more likely to get breast cancer if you have a sister or a mother that had breast cancer, is that genetic, or does that mean that you were just exposed to the same crap that your sister and your mother were, right? Because it's a fact that if you're black or Hispanic, if you're a minority, you're more likely to live in and more likely to work in an area where you're exposed to chemicals that we know are associated with these poor health outcomes. The same goes for people who live in low-income situations. More words from my sponsor. Again, if you make money off the stuff, you have a different perspective. Depends on your perspective. I guess if you're not living there and you're not being exposed to it, then yeah, I guess it has been used safely because they've been giving it to other people to use. So here's what I think. Here's what I want you to think about now, and I'm just about done. I study an aquatic organism, so it's highly susceptible to, it's highly susceptible to chemicals in the water, right? But so are we. In our early developmental stages, we're an aquatic organism. And I would argue that my frogs, trapped in a contaminated pond or a contaminated aquarium, are no different than a young fetus trapped in a contaminated amniotic fluid, trapped in a contaminated amniotic sac. Because you just heard about, sorry, I keep looking over there, over here. You just heard about Gates. The placenta was not designed to keep out the 80,000 chemicals that we've invented. And studies now show that we are exposed to over 300 chemicals before we leave the womb, before you even enter this world to get your occupational exposure and your exposure from the air. You are exposed to over 300 chemicals. And the hormones that are determining if you're male or female, that are determining if you're going to orient as a male or female, that are determining how big you're going to be, that are determining how likely you are to develop breast cancer or prostate cancer, those hormones are the same that we're studying in a frog. And these individuals are exposed to those same chemicals in mixtures most of which we know nothing about. Another graduate student of mine has shown that if you take a breast cancer cell and give it atrazine, it starts expressing aromatase and making estrogen. Okay? That's a problem, because remember, we just heard about Dr. Pang. Am I saying your last name right? Was just saying that some chemicals need a key to get through the gate. Turns out that breast cancer cells, the estrogen needs a key. Here's a question for you. When do most women get breast cancer, which is the #1 cancer in women now, by the way? Before or after menopause? After. So how much sense does that make, that you're getting an estrogen-dependent cancer when your estrogen levels are lower than they've ever been in your blood, in your life? Here's why. One, breast cancer depends on a lifetime exposure to estrogen. So all that time that you're being exposed to estrogenic chemicals, and we know we have hard data for many of these chemicals. Also, breast cancer depends on the local expression of aromatase, the enzyme that converts testosterone into estrogen. So that even though your blood levels of estrogen might be low, the cancer is making its own estrogen. And the estrogen is the key, like Dr. Payne was talking about, to make that damaged cell grow and turn into a tumor. Here's how much we know about the importance of that aromatase. The #1 treatment for breast cancer right now is a chemical called letrozole. Again, chemical that you're putting in your body. And letrozole knocks out aromatase and decreases estrogen. So if you get breast cancer right now, this is the chemical they're going to give you to treat it. Typical. How does that add up when the #1 contaminant of drinking water, one that's been found here in Waimea, does exactly the opposite? It turns on aromatase, it increases estrogen, opens that gate, and causes that cell, that damaged cell, to turn into a tumor. In fact, this company, the same company, makes both chemicals. I published a paper called The One-Stop Shop, Chemical Causes and Cures for Breast Cancer, and they sent the lawyer after me. So Novartis Oncology, which makes 80 million, gave us 80 million pounds a year of atrazine, now makes the aromatase blocker. So that the #1 contaminant of drinking water that turns on aromatase is made by the same company that's trying to turn your aromatase off. So that if you're living in a contaminated area taking letrozole for your breast cancer, that mixture has to fight it out in your body now by another chemical made by the same company. So there are other studies I don't have time to tell you about. Rats are a surrogate. We use rats to help us understand ourselves because we don't want to experiment on ourselves. Studies have shown that atrazine causes prostate and mammary cancer in rats. Studies have shown that atrazine causes immune failure, just like we've shown in frogs. Studies have shown that if rats are exposed when they're pregnant, the babies come out with neural damage. They can't do simple tasks that a rat should be able to do. And here are studies that weren't done by me but changed my life. These studies were all done, you can Google them, by the EPA themselves. 3 different laboratories. One showed that if you give a rat atrazine, you're more likely to have an abortion. So it screws up the chemical balance so much that the rat can't maintain the pregnancy and they have a miscarriage. Another EPA laboratory showed that of those rats that don't abort, the sons, the male pups, are born with prostate disease. They're born with the prostate of an old man. Another study showed that of those rats that don't abort, and this is a 3rd EPA laboratory, that the daughters are born with breasts that won't develop properly. And when those rats grow up and reproduce, their offspring have retarded growth and development because the mother can't make enough milk. Here's what really got me involved in public speaking and stepping outside of the university. Right here. This rat never saw atrazine. This rat was never exposed to atrazine. This rat was affected by atrazine that its grandmother was exposed to. And these aren't my data. This was published by the EPA. This was published by a U.S. government laboratory. This rat is affected by atrazine that its grandmother was exposed to. This rat never saw atrazine. So when you think about like this breast cancer stuff, and you're living in a contaminated community, that means that you can move away, and 2 generations later, you can still be impacted because of chemicals that your grandmother was exposed to. This means that my daughter, that all of your daughters, that their granddaughters could be impacted by chemicals that we're using today. This is not about you and me. We've already been exposed. Your likelihood of getting breast cancer or prostate cancer has already been impacted by things that your mother, potentially your grandmother, was exposed to. We're talking about now 2 generations away. We're talking about chemicals like atrazine, which France banned it 15 years ago. It is still in the aquifers. It has not changed. The levels have not changed in 10 years. So we're talking about using chemicals today that your grandchildren's grandchildren may be impacted by. That changed me in a huge way. in terms of my sense of responsibility. This is a paper that just came out 2 years ago, and let me apologize. There's some images coming up. This was published by the Center for Disease Control and peer-reviewed and published by a government agency. And they wrote, maternal exposure to surface water atrazine is associated with fetal gastroparesis, particularly in spring conceptions. It's just a correlation. We don't have an experimental model to look at it yet. It's just correlation. Here's another study that just came out a few months ago in September. Common pesticide linked to birth defects. They wrote the following. Again, this is Center for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health. Maternal exposure to a common herbicide atrazine is associated with a nearly twofold higher risk of having offspring with a rare birth defect of the navel cavity called choanal atresia. It's only correlation. But these are United States government agencies publishing this work and still telling you that 3 parts per billion is okay in your drinking water. Telling you that if you're a factory worker or a farm worker breathing this stuff and then getting this stuff across your skin and inhaling your stuff, these are government agencies that are still telling you that atrazine is safe for use. They lie, and in part they lie because scientists who work for the company sit on those government boards. It's a fact. You can Google it and see their names. Google Cloas Vernon. You'll see him working for Syngenta, and you'll see him sitting on the EPA Safety Review Panel. Google Ron Kendall. You'll see him published for Syngenta, and then you'll see him sitting on the EPA Scientific Advisory Panel. I changed my view about my role in this whole thing. Because of not my work, but because of the work I just showed you. The impact on humans. My advisor, and I love him, I'm not trying to dog him out here or anything, told me in the beginning, don't be an advocate, Tyrone. He said, let the science speak for itself. But then I read things from Syngenta. They have this on their website. Syngenta assumes no obligation to update forward-looking statements to reflect actual results. One who says shit like that, first off. But then this is the one that really impacted me. This was written in 2006 about my data. The EPA said the ultimate decision is much bigger than science. It weighs in public opinion. But if I'm in the ivory tower, if I'm in a university publishing my work in fancy journals so that I can get promoted that aren't available to the public, and the EPA is counting on you to have an opinion, how can that be? If I'm hiding my work away in some fancy journal that nobody has access to except other academics, how can I let the science speak for itself when Syngenta says those kinds of things, and when the EPA, who's supposed to be protecting you, us, says these kinds of things? They're counting on you to do their job. I'll end here. I won't talk about how I've crossed the line in terms of becoming an advocate. But I will be around for other discussions to talk about ways that you can, well, you're already involved. And maybe you can tell me some ways that I can get more involved and anything else that you want to talk about. Thank you again for your time, and I'm really happy to be here.